All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a great honor to have Dr. Pelcovitz joining us from New Jersey. Sorry.
No, New York.
New York.
Yeah,
Dr. Pelcovitz, I think most of you would have read his bio. I really don't want to take up, just from a personal point of view. When I first went into the rabbinate and found my way to New York, everybody that I met said, you have to find Dr. Pelcovitz. And when I did find his office, he made so much time to be able to help a young rabbi, and was just so benevolent with his time. And it's started a relationship that has really grown for the last 15 odd years. And it is a great honor to have him here joining all of us across Sydney. I'd like to thank all the schools that have joined in, Kesed Torah, Masada College, Mount Sinai, the Jewish House, and to all the different schools that have joined up. It's a great privilege to have you. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Pelcovitz.
Thank you so much. It's truly an honor to be here. Is my screen shared, or do I need to do that?
I will ensure that you can. Give me a sec. Let me see how we do that. Give me 2 secs. Okay. I'll allow you to share screen. I'm just concerned if in the event of bombing, but if it does, we'll address that if it happens.
Okay, it'll make for an interesting challenge. Okay, fine. So you can see the screen okay?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, great. Okay, fine. So it's a pleasure to be here. Sorry it's for such challenging times. Let me explain to you what we'll be focusing on in the next hour or so. I'm going to start with some thoughts on for ourselves. How do we manage our own anxiety and such frightening times? What are some basic approaches to anxiety management? And then the last part, I'm going to focus on coping with uncertain financial times, with the focus on how to help our children. I'll go back and forth. Rabbi, how much time should I leave for questions? How do we do that?
I think we can go until you're done, and then we can see how we can negotiate questions. Baruch Hashem, there are a lot of people on the line, so we're just going to have to figure out how we're going to manage that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, good. So let me go right into this. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to start with the story because I find that's often the best way to get important information over. And it's in terms of, in general, when it comes to managing anxiety, you have to think about 3 channels that we have to tune into. The first channel is the cognitive channel, which is basically what are our thoughts. Our thoughts will often be the most important component of anxiety management. What things do we say to ourselves? Then the second channel is physiologic, kind of the body keeps the score, and we'll talk about that a little bit, and then finally the behavioral. So let me start with the story for the cognitive, because it's the way that I personally find it is a powerful way that I came to fully appreciate the cognitive component. A number of years ago, I was scholar in residence in a shul in New Jersey, and they had me speak after Kiddush at the one of the big rooms there. It was a talk on parenting, and it had a very good turnout. People who were very motivated wanted to hear the parenting talk. So it's this packed room, and in the back of the room there was a mother who was holding a 6-month-old baby who was crying. and people couldn't hear me speak. This is on Shabbos, there was no microphone, and she couldn't hear me. They couldn't hear me speak at all. So the audience was getting very angry and was sort of yelling at the mother to either shush the baby or to leave the room. And she was intent on wanting to stay and listen. And there was an unusual amount of tension, yelling and screaming on both sides. Suddenly, right in front of me, in the front of the room, right in front of where I was standing, an elderly man gets up and he turns to face the audience. And he says, "You all know me. I've been living in this community for many, many years. And you all know that 70 years ago, I was liberated from Auschwitz." Then he says, "If you had told me 70 years ago that 70 years from now, there will come a day where on a Shabbos morning, there's going to be 400 people gathering together to hear how to integrate and apply the wisdom of Torah to their daily lives as parents," I would have thought you were out of your mind. I would have said, it's not possible. I just didn't think that we were going to survive as a people that way. But then, if you would have told me, what's going to happen 7 years from now? There are going to be 400 people sitting and listening to the wisdom of Torah and integrating it into life. And in the back of the room, there was going to be a Jewish baby crying hysterically. I would have been totally shocked. And then he turns to everybody with tears in his eyes. He says, "Do you know what a miracle this is? Do you know what a miracle it is to have a healthy Jewish child with a mother committed enough to want to learn how to be a better parent? And to be able to hear that child crying," he says, "this is a miracle we're witnessing." Two things happened from what he said. First of all, the mother calmed down because she was feeling terrible tension, and the baby stopped crying. The baby didn't make any kind of noise for the entire talk. And the entire audience also totally calmed down, and we bounced off each other with our anxiety and with our concerns. But most importantly, from that day on, anytime I'm giving a talk and there's some kind of annoying noise in the background or there's a crying baby, I remember that day and I just smile. Sometimes I'll share the story. Sometimes I'll just smile inwardly because it permanently changed my perspective. The Baal Shem Tov, right, the founder of Hasidus, said, which translates into, you want to know where a person really is, it's where his or her thoughts are. So that's channel number one. It's the power of cognition and the fact that we have a tremendous role in terms of managing our anxiety just by tuning into our thoughts. And I'm going to get into that in more detail in another minute. On the physiologic channel, it's important, to just focus on the power of the physiologic. We're all in a state of heightened arousal because there's real threat. This is one of those times in life, living in a time of a pandemic. There is tremendous tension. And many of us have been stuck at home with needing to do all kinds of things in terms of the education of our children, in terms of the challenge of not being able necessarily to have direct contact with our grandchildren, depending on what stage of life we're in. And we just have to remember the power of a break and the power of exercise. I'll get to that in another minute. And then the final aspect of anxiety is the behavioral channel. In other words, what could we do? How do we avoid avoidance? Avoid avoidance means that in order to manage anxiety well, we have to be able to face our fears and not run away from our fears. And that'll make more sense as I go on to the next slide. This is a slide coming from a close colleague of mine who I've been working very closely together with, especially in the last couple of weeks. His name is Dr. David Rosemary. He's a professor at Harvard University Hospital, McLean's, where he's the head for the Center for Psychology and Religion. And he's an expert in stress and managing anxiety, the head of the Center for Anxiety in Midtown Manhattan, and is a very accomplished person that has some extremely important lessons to impart to us. So in an article he wrote just last week in Scientific American, he talks about, he gives the following important point. He says, look, right now, we have to understand it's totally normal to feel anxiety. The way we're wired, it's very hard to tolerate any situation that is uncontrollable and uncertain. And the COVID-19 pandemic is by definition uncontrollable and uncertain. He says that in reality, even self-quarantine and social distancing can slow but not stop viral contagion. But then the next point here is all important. Once we accept the reality that our sense of certainty and control is an illusion, it's always an illusion. People always are living in a world where we tend to have this feeling that as long as we're good and worthy people, bad things won't happen to us. As long as we play it right, we're sort of protected. And the reality is that we've always been living on a narrow bridge. The reality is, God willing, the vast majority of us, even if we get the virus, the vast majority of people, the symptoms have been mild and workable. The most vulnerable, unfortunately, it's a little more ominous. But as he says here, once we accept the reality that our sense of certainty and control is an illusion, once we understand and appreciate our inherent vulnerability, we emerge with the inner strength to face the crisis with greater equanimity. I know that's kind of a contradiction, but that's I think a very important point. And now I'm going away from Dr. Rosemary and just in general to talk about how important it is at times like this to have clarity of feelings, okay? So to identify and understand our emotions clearly and in a manner that interprets negative emotions as beneficial has been associated with better anxiety management. Okay, let me put this in more simple English. The president of Yale University in Connecticut used to be the head of the psychology department there. His name is Dr. Salovey. He's actually a Soloveitchik who is descended from the famous Brisker dynasty. You know, comes from a very, very prominent rabbinic family, although he himself doesn't necessarily have a formal background there in terms of formal Judaic studies. But brilliant man. And his research has the following deep message to it. It says when something really traumatic happens to us, there are two modes of dealing with terrible stress in our life. One is to view ourselves as a log floating on the river at the mercy of the current. Okay? That's basically, as his cousin, Rabbi Soloveitchik at Yeshiva University, in the last generation, called the go-roll approach. It's the lottery approach. So things are random. We have no control over anything, and we're basically in a passive position. Or, Dr. Salovey says, we could view it as an engine of growth. He calls it post-traumatic growth. We could recognize that instead of focusing on the helplessness, instead to focus on what there is to be grateful for, instead of focusing on the helplessness, we could focus how at a time like this, we could come to appreciate what matters most in our life. And he says, when you go from that position of passivity to a position instead of, which is go roll, to a position instead of, this is an incredible opportunity for me to clarify my values. Okay? And that's exactly what studies show. Okay? Over and over again. I'll just give you an example to bring it home. One of the studies he talks about this power and the power of the mind over our actions. It's the hotel maid study. They go to a hotel chain, and they randomly assign hotel maids into two groups. One group is randomly assigned to do their regular hotel maid duties, cleaning rooms, changing sheets, vacuuming. The other group is randomly assigned and told you're part of an important study on health and wellness in the workplace. So as you change the sheets of the bed, recognize that you're working your upper biceps. As you vacuum, it's aerobic exercise, and you're building up a different muscle group. And they break down every single action that a hotel maid does and reframes it in the context of meaning and purpose, that we're going to better understand how to stay healthy in a workplace environment. They did exactly the same thing as they always did, or as the comparison group did. And it was fascinating what that perception did to this group. The group that were part of the wellness study, within 4 months, without trying to, they lost a very significant amount of weight. The other thing that was fascinating is that their mood went from being mildly or very depressed to the depression vanished. Their general sense of well-being completely improved. The activity was the same, but they saw what they were doing as having purpose and as being an engine of growth. Okay? So if you look over here at this last bullet, labeling an anxious feeling and understanding that the anxiety is due to whatever it is that we're tying the anxiety to can help people kind of decide to clarify what are our goals, what's our purpose. And that's an extremely important part of this, okay? It's the power of naming the monster, okay? So simply verbally labeling the emotional content of a frightening situation, even if you're not trying to change your emotional response, has been associated with reduced anxiety levels, okay? And decreases in the part of our nervous system, in the part of our brain that's involved in anxiety, okay? So I know this sounds a little strange, and it's not a way that we're used to thinking, but there have been, especially in the last decade, a tremendous number of studies that show the power of being able to have clarity, being able to just talk about how we're feeling. And again, we're now in very close quarters very often, could be with a spouse, it could be with a child, it could be with a parent, whatever your living situation might be, but to be able to turn towards each other and support each other's and make time to be able to talk and share your feelings, and most importantly, to validate the feelings, even if you have a different coping style, is all important. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about challenges for children. Okay, this comes from what I've been hearing from various heads of school in the New York City area, where unfortunately there's been, I think it's now the highest rate of, the virus in the world, unfortunately. And in a way that's a little overwhelming. So this is what kids are experiencing. They're saying suddenly almost everybody around me is nervous, okay? And we have to remember the kids do much better with structure and routine, okay? We do much better with structure and routine. We're all wired for connection with the other, okay? I mean, it's natural. You know, even as I go walking down the street here, because we're still allowed to go walking down the street as long as we keep a 6-foot distance, okay? And there's like, people are so much more connected than they usually are in a typical New York neighborhood. Suddenly, neighbors who may not have ever said a word to me are coming over and introducing themselves. It's just a sense, look, we're all in this together. And we have to remember, though, that for kids, especially adolescents, isolation from friends is difficult and confusing. It's very hard not to be able to see your grandparents, even though there's an awful lot we could do if we're able to share, you know, real quality time with them. There's all kinds of wonderful materials out there. I listen to podcasts made for children together with my grandchildren. We share, you know, we have a great time together on Zoom, but very hard to do it, especially if you have a busy schedule, unless you ritualize it. In order to make things really happen, you make it into a ritual, meaning that every weekday at 4 p.m. after your kids are finished with whatever homeschooling they're getting, whatever distance learning they're getting, that you're going to sit down with your grandchild and you're going to, you know, listen to some of your favorite music together, or do some favorite activities together, or share just talking about the day. One of my grandchildren has been writing a little preschooler has been writing little books about this evil COVID-19 and about children who misbehave by shaking people's hands even though they're not allowed to. And they're funny and they're filled with art, and it's just been amazing to see how this has unleashed creativity in you know, in the youngest parts of my extended family. So that's the challenge for children. Here's a general set of guidelines on how to talk to children about the virus. The main thing to remember is that even though it may feel like they understand everything that's going on, and they probably do, it's important to make time to sit down and talk to them. Remember, you can't mess it up because this is a process, not an event. But by having a formal discussion where you say, guys, let's sit down. I know you know everything about this, but it's just helpful to talk about it. And you have a family discussion in a comfortable place. Shut off your cell phone, shut off any other form of distraction, and talk to them. The main thing is to be understood, first understand. Ask them the basic question, okay? Which is simple question. What's your understanding of what's going on? And then once they tell you what their understanding is, which may be totally accurate, at least you're helping them clarify their feelings and be able to talk about it. You probably need to have a separate discussion for younger children, okay? Begin by asking them what they know and hear what they have. Preschoolers, in a variety of research studies, the two developmental stages that are toughest for children who are going through tough times are preschoolers and adolescents. So preschoolers, because preschoolers tend to get it wrong, they tend to misunderstand, they're more likely to blame themselves, they're more likely at times like this to regress and to become more clingy and to want to sleep next to you in bed, which is totally fine, according to most trauma experts, and just negotiate getting them out of the bed later. Don't pull them into your bed if they don't want to come, but if they need to, we're supposed to tolerate a higher level of clinginess at a time like this, and just to be there for them. So that's an important point. Okay. This is all important, this bullet, okay? Please, please, please minimize exposure to media, okay? If you have a news channel blaring in the background all day, which I know is very, very tempting, it's not good for your kids, it's not good for you, okay? Try to get your news out of your smartphone, okay, in a way that you're able to mediate it between your children and you. And study after study, I was part of a study after 9/11 that showed that families that were watching a lot of CNN or Fox News after the World Trade Center collapse, those kids were in much higher risk, and those adults were much higher risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, and it totally crippled their recovery. They eventually recovered psychologically, but it took much, much longer. And it's not necessary. You know, there are ways of getting our information in smaller doses, you know, ways of setting up alerts. It's much easier to do that now, okay? So, and then encourage questions, validate feelings. The Hebrew word ashrei, which is the Hebrew word for the highest level of happiness, is etymologically tied to the word ishur, which means to validate. There's nothing quite as comforting as validating the feelings of your family members, be it the adults or the children, without arguing about it, because we're going to all deal with this in totally different kinds of ways. Remember the power of art, writing, and music. An expert on resilience said that art is making something out of nothing. Humor is making nothing out of something. And they're incredibly, incredibly helpful ways of dealing. Explain to children that that if somebody in the family has a cold now, it doesn't mean that they have COVID-19. You know, you might have to just reassure them. And the most important thing is the situation changes constantly, okay? I've been constantly giving different talks to different communities, and it's constantly shifting as the situation changes. So we have to periodically check back with our kids, because it could be that as time goes on, there might be stricter restrictions that come on, or that there might be more direct exposure to the impact of the illness. So it's just an important thing to keep checking back in, okay? Again, virtual contact is golden, okay? And it's so important to try to ritualize that for your kids and for yourself with extended family and friends. We have an obligation to reach out now to the people in our community who are most isolated. If somebody now, for medical reasons, has to have their Seder alone, there's no greater education for your kids or for yourselves than to really reach out with calls, if it's possible to have a visit from a safe distance, with arranging food. And the best coping mechanisms for children is to have them pitch in. You don't want to overburden them, but have them pitch in, have them help prepare food packages, have them help in any way they can. There's a school in Philadelphia that they figured out a way to use technology, 3D printing, to print masks. So that all the kids have been pulled into printing masks, which is literally life-saving now that there just aren't enough protective masks around for the overwhelmed medical system here. As of, I think in a few days, it's just going to be whatever. There's woefully inadequate supply for a variety of reasons. Hopefully that's not a reality in Sydney. Hopefully, from what I hear, it's not. Whatever. Hopefully that's something that you'll never have to deal with there. But the power of chesed is all important. Remember, the Hebrew word natan, to give, is a palindrome. It's spelled the same forward as backwards. Okay? Consistent schedules, including bedtime, meals, and exercise, is all important. Okay. The other thing is the focus on hope. The Hebrew word hope is the word tikva. Embedded in the word tikva actually in Hebrew means a rope or a cord. That's one of the meanings of that word. So embedded in the word is the word kav, or a cord, meaning nobody is dangling alone there. We all have the connection, be it if we are spiritually connected, be it connection to God, or be it a connection to our families and friends if we're more oriented in that way. But there's always hope. We're not twisting in the wind below. And that's an incredibly important component. I want to make one other really important point before I forget, which is the power of two different kinds of communication, okay? You could communicate through text or through phone calls, through Zoom like we're doing, or through text. Let me just share with you one study that I find very important to understand. Study goes like this. They take a group of 4th grade girls, a team of psychologists, and they do something mildly upsetting to the 4th grade girls. And they're randomly assigned into 2 groups. One group is asked to call their mother for comfort. The other group is randomly assigned to text their mothers for comfort. The group that calls their mother for comfort, the soothing voice of their mother, leads to their totally becoming chilled out, okay? Their cortisol levels go down, blood pressure goes down, pulse rate goes down, they go back to baseline, and the anxiety disappears with the soothing words of the mother. The very same words texted by the control group to their daughters, the very same words, does absolutely nothing to the girl's anxiety level. Okay, cortisol levels remain elevated, blood pressure remains elevated, every physiologic correlate of stress remains elevated. So again, the key is there's tremendous room for texting. Texting is incredible, and it is a form of connection. But if you have a choice, if possible, Zoom, if possible, a call, because it's a different level of empathy and connection. Okay, we're good with that? Okay, let's keep going. Now I'm going to get to the heart of the ingredients of resilience. Dr. Tal Ben-Shachar, who's a colleague who I've been privileged to work with at times, he's a world-renowned expert on resilience. I don't know if you ever had him in Sydney, but he taught a course at Harvard for a number of years that was the most popular course in the history of Harvard. If you were going to get into his course, when you were an entering freshman at Harvard, you'd have to register for his course for the last semester of your studies at Harvard, otherwise you would never get it. He had thousands of people in his class on the psychology of happiness. And he's since then moved back to Israel, where he was originally from, spends his time between Israel and different parts of the United States. And he last week gave a phenomenal talk on resilience in the age of COVID. I'm going to share with you his take-home messages, putting in a lot of my own stuff. I don't want him to be blamed for some of the stuff I say that are really not his. But here's the core ingredients of what he recommends, and it's the ABCs. A is for affect. And what he talks about there is a key way of dealing with anxiety is to give yourself permission to be human, to allow yourself to experience a full range of emotions, including anxiety, including stress, including anger, and including love, and including compassion, including gratitude. And he makes this really important point documented by a number of research studies. All emotions flow through one pipeline. If I block one, I'm not allowing joy and love rumors. Golda Meir always had some of the best quotes for helping us through tough times. Golda Meir, when she was Prime Minister of Israel, she had the following brilliant observation. Those who don't know how to weep with their whole heart don't know how to laugh either. Okay? So what this means is that you sort of in a Teflon kind of way, sort of like in a non-sticky kind of way, you allow those emotions in. Not in a sticky way, but allow them to flow over you. And now I'm going to share with you just a very quick vignette, maybe not so quick, but a vignette that's all important. And it has to do with the study that I was involved in shortly after 9/11. Shortly after 9/11, I was working with a prominent psychiatrist who had been at Harvard, then at Boston University, and we were doing some work on the DSM, on the diagnostic manual used by mental health professionals, and we were working on the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis together based on some field trials that we had done. And he was extremely passionate about understanding trauma. And one day, as we're working together, I was hospital-based then, he comes running into my office all excited. He was like, he was totally filled with excitement. And he says, David, look. And he shows me an fMRI, a picture of the brain of one of his clients who was stuck in the stairwell of the World Trade Center as it was collapsing on 9/11. And at the moment that this patient was having a flashback to the worst moment of his life, when he thought he was about to die. And it was an amazing thing to see. Because you know what the brain looks like at that moment? When you think your life is over, your life is threatened? Brokaw's area is shut down. The language centers of the brain are completely shut down. But then, this is where it gets very, very helpful. As he did therapy, and as he connected to this patient of his, who happened to have been a psychiatrist himself, as he gave him words for his pain, and helped him name the monster, and helped him integrate it, and helped him digest it, the post-traumatic symptoms gave way to much more manageable levels of anxiety. He showed me subsequent scans where you literally saw Brokaw's area, the language centers of the brain, lighting up. And that's, again, the power of being able to name the monster. Interestingly, in the early 1900s, a well-known rabbi in Jerusalem, Rabbi Harlap, actually a relative of my wife's family. So Rabbi Harlap wrote a Haggadah for the Seder night called the Main Morrow. And in it, he has exactly the same concept. He says, slavery, when we were slaves in Egypt, it took away our koach hadibur. It took away our ability to talk, our ability to use language to deal with our pain. Slaves don't have that luxury. And what's our answer to that? When we sit down at the Seder table, okay, in a very short amount of time, we're going to be sitting around that table. And what's that called? It's called Magid. Magid is that we sit down together as a people and we give words for our answer to those tough times, okay? And we sit together with the power of a family and the power of that root system, and we light up Brokaw's area. And it's literally called Magid for that reason, okay? The next point here is the Pennebaker. I realize that I could get totally carried away here with a million stories for you, but he's the world-renowned psychologist who worked with Steven Spielberg in the Holocaust project in terms of just sitting with survivors of the Holocaust and writing down their memories and experiences about what happened to them during those horrific years. And what Dr. Pennebaker found was that as you write about tough times, he found that it seemed to help the survivors with their health and with their mood. And there's a lot of very strong evidence about the power of writing, and to the extent that you have that style, it could be a very helpful way of managing strong feelings, okay? And then the final quote here on affect is, we want to fulfill happiness, we need to allow unhappiness. And one last thing, I just for the sake of time, I'll just share with you one piece that's important. In addition to allowing emotions, allow tears. If at times we find tears coming, that's incredibly therapeutic. So if you find yourself crying in front of your children because of all the stress, or because of, God forbid, any loss, or even if it's the stress of loss of income, which we're going to be getting to in a few minutes, if you take tears that come from an allergy and put them under a microscope, it's going to be salt and water, nothing else. If you take emotional tears and put them under the microscope, guess what it has in it? It has cortisol. It has other chemicals that show that as we cry, we're releasing stress hormones, meaning it's literally we're healing ourselves through tears. So if you find yourself crying, you just explain to your kids, you know, I'm kind of stressed out, but don't worry, I find that it's good to talk about it. Sometimes it's even good to cry. And then whatever self-soothing statements you make, you model it for your children by sharing it with them. Gratitude is all important, okay? And I'll tell you a technique, and I'll tell you a story. The technique goes like this, okay? It's one you've heard before, I'm sure, and it's the power of counting your blessings. So if you have the ritual of every Friday night sitting around the Shabbos table, and you go around to your family and have them each share one thing from the week they're grateful for, and one time during the week that they were able to help somebody else or were helped by somebody else, here's what happens when you share one thing from the week that you're grateful for. First thing that happens is your happiness levels will shoot up. Second thing that happens is counting your blessings has been associated with very respected studies in leading medical journals with improved cardiac functioning and improved immune functioning. It literally makes you healthier. So you have every right to be pulled into anxiety and negativity. Validate that, that's fine. But to try to turn the switch on, to then focus on some things in your life you're grateful for. Before you go to sleep, get 2 or 3 images in your head of things that you're grateful for. It can make an incredible, incredible difference. I'll just share with you one story before I move on, and that's a story of a rabbi, a well-known rabbi in Jerusalem, that every Rosh Chodesh, at the beginning of every Jewish month, he would go to Shaare Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem and just wait in the lobby. So those of you who have been there know in the lobby, it's a huge lobby and there are signs to all the different departments. But he wouldn't go to visit anybody. And he'd go every Rosh Chodesh and he would hang out in the lobby. And people didn't understand what he was doing there because they would offer him directions. You know, you want to know how to get to this department or that department? He would just say, no, I'm fine. So finally, somebody asked him, what are you doing here every Rosh Chodesh? So he said the following. He said, it's very easy to be grateful, and this is what the research shows, to the people we owe the least to people who help us, to total strangers who help us in unexpected ways. It's extremely easy, okay? So if people, let's say you're driving on the road and you have a flat tire, and a total stranger stops and helps you change your flat, you're going to be extremely grateful to that person, as we should be. He said, but it's much harder to be grateful to those who we owe the most to. Okay, my father the blessed memory would call it the ordeal of the ordinary. If we're used to something, it's the ordeal of the ordinary, okay? So basically, we tend to be least grateful to our mothers, to our fathers, to our children, to our friends, to our spouse. So he says, let me tell you what I'm doing here. First, I'll look at neurology and I'll say to myself, you know what a miracle it is that even though I'm an older man, I have a brain that's functioning well. I know that in neurology, there are people who are struggling with Alzheimer's or struggling with, God forbid, with a brain tumor. And I'm just sitting and thinking how thankful I have to be for the miracle of a brain that's functioning well and able to think clearly. Then I look at gastroenterology and I think about the miracle that my gastrointestinal system is working okay. It's so fragile. If something is open that should be closed or something that should be closed is open, I wouldn't be able to last very long. So I thank God for a well-functioning GI tract. And then I do the same thing with cardiology, and he does it with every single department there. And after a few hours there, he says he goes back home, having reset his gratitude clock to remember what he has to be grateful for. I can't emphasize enough how powerful the research is on us being able to turn that switch on and dealing with tough times, okay? And remember, this part is from Dr. Ben Shachar, right? He says, you can always find something to be grateful for, even in tough times. It might be a great meal, it might be a smile, it might be just the ability to see beyond the situation, because with God's help, this situation is temporary. Things will, God willing, go back to the new normal. And we need to be grateful for what we have, okay? On the behavioral level of the ABCs, I can't emphasize enough the power of exercise. To exercise, obviously, in every study is incredibly, incredibly helpful for anxiety and depression, and it's like as powerful as any psychiatric medication in the comparative studies. But also, this is important. Not exercising is like taking a depressant. We could almost guarantee that we're going to become more depressed than we need to be if we don't exercise. So to find a way to clear your head. And again, if you can't leave your house, you could download literally hundreds and hundreds of podcasts and different kinds of programs on how to do strength training, on how to do aerobic training. It'll make all the difference in your life. And then finally on behavior, that aspect of the ABC, it's the power of connections. The number one predictor of happiness is quality time with people we care about and who care about us. It's also the number one predictor of physical well-being. And put aside time as a daily ritual to connect with people outside of our home. As Francis Bacon said, friendship doubles joy and cuts grief in half. And then finally, there's the C of cognition, which is distraction. And, there's a real benefit. Some of us have a coping style that does well with distraction. Others of us have a coping style that does well with talking things out. And, we need to figure out what's our toolbox of coping mechanism and to tolerate a totally different toolbox of coping mechanisms of our family members. That's another really important point. Financial stress. A lot of the points in this I've gone through, but how do we deal with those of us who now don't have any income coming in, those of us who have lost our jobs? It's terrifying, and it's a whole different way of thinking. What I'm going to share with you is the wisdom from the Iowa studies. Iowa in the United States has a phenomenally valuable set of insights from what I'm about to share with you. Let me tell you what happened there. In Iowa in the 1970s, there were people who were very wealthy. They were living on big farms. They were making quite a bit of money as farmers. They had a tremendous amount of land, and they and their children were living with tremendous affluence. Then a huge crisis hit. I forget exactly what the crisis was about. And virtually everybody in all of these wealthy farmers literally lost the farm. They lost everything that they had. They literally lost what they had. And a very talented researcher, Dr. Connors, he started a study that went on for a generation to see what predicted resilience in people who went from having everything to having nothing. They went from living in these huge farms to being in a small one-room studio apartment if they were lucky. They went from having everything to having nothing. Kids who had a million toys no longer had them, okay? And what happened? What predicted resilience? And when I share this with you, it's going to be totally, it's going to make a lot of sense. But this is based on a generation of research from one of the most respected researchers in psychology in the United States. Okay, so let me move to the 5 C's in terms of what he found to be the ingredients of resilience. Number 1, okay, is he found that families that manage to control their fighting, when you're under a lot of stress, especially under a lot of financial stress, it's very tempting to fight. It puts tremendous stress on a couple, tremendous stress on a marriage. And when children are exposed to conflict between their parents, or if the conflict is about them, it destroys them. And what he found is when couples found a way to disagree, but to disagree not in front of the kids. To disagree, again, as my father would always say, couples don't have to think alike, they have to think together, okay? So to find a way to go into some private place if you possibly can, or where you're out for a walk, or wait for the kids to be asleep, and to strike when the iron is cold, to talk about the conflict at a calmer time, but not to do it in front of your kids. I had a doctoral student a few years back who did a study of comparing adolescent children of Balei Tshuva, people who grew up not being actively observant, and then they became actively observant. And she compared them also to a group of adolescent children, of people who were observant from the very beginning of their lives. And she looked what's associated with good outcomes in both groups and what's not associated with good outcomes. And it turned out the predictors in both groups, one of the main predictors of problems is conflict over childhood. When a couple, members of a couple would disagree over religious practice, or would disagree over other things that were important to them. And when you saw the power of her finding on a large group that was then replicated in an even more powerful way by Dr. Ariel Kaur at Israel, it was phenomenal, because it really awakened me to the incredible importance of, I can beg you one thing. Every fiber of your being is going to have a couple want to kill each other at a time like this when there's financial stress. It is extremely stressful. And the most normal thing in the world is to fight. Bite your tongue, okay? You'll never regret putting it off till a time later. You schedule a time. Avoidance of conflict is not good either. If you stonewall and don't talk about it, it'll build the stress up, and that's associated with bad stuff also. But again, strike when the iron is cold and find a quiet time to talk about it, okay? Okay, let's move on. Yeah, it's my father. Okay, next, so that's the first C, is the C of conflict. The second C is, by the way, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with you. Rabbi Krebs, do you have a copy of this? Did I send it to you?
You haven't sent it to me.
Oh yeah, just remind me and I'll send it, and everybody, for whatever it's worth, you don't even have to pay attention anymore, because you'll have this, and then you could not listen to me, you can take a nap. Okay, So here it's, I already talked about lighting up Brokaw's area. The Yom Kippur War study was also incredibly important for us at times like this. A team of researchers in Israel followed a group of kids whose fathers were killed in the Yom Kippur War. And then this team followed adjustment in the kids as even after their mothers remarried into adulthood. And one of the key predictors of good outcomes in these kids, one of the key predictors of resilience in these Yom Kippur War orphans, was the ability of their mothers to continue to model crying in front of the children and expressing sadness about the loss of their father, even if they were in a wonderful marriage in their second marriage. They gave them the gift of tears and totally validated being able to communicate the bittersweet memories of how wonderful their father was, or just to be honest about all that stuff. Okay, so that's the communication. Next, any way you go from passive to active. And I already talked about the power of required helpfulness in 3 very well done studies. You know, the highest level of research integrity, you know, where they looked at everybody born on 3 different islands, the Isle of Wight off the coast of Vermouth, the island of Kauai, and Martha's Vineyard. These were all places that were filled with a tremendous amount of crime, poverty, and abuse. And they followed every kid born on those islands, in the case of Kauai in 1956, into adulthood to see what predicted resilience in spite of the high level of crime, violence, and abuse there. They followed them from the time they were in the baby nursery. And one of the core ingredients of resilience in those 3 island studies was that kids didn't just take, they also gave. Without overburdening them, they weren't robbed of their childhood, but they all had a role in terms of chesed. The sniper study was one of the first school shootings in the United States in the early 90s. A colleague of mine at UCLA, the University in Los Angeles, he did a fascinating study. He was working trying to understand why is it some kids were very, very symptomatic after the shooting and others seemed to be resilient. So I'll tell you just the vignette about 2 9-year-olds. There were 2 9-year-olds who were pinned down by the gunfire, and unfortunately a number of kids were killed in that shooting. And one of the kids was totally crippled by PTSD symptoms, and the other kid was totally resilient. Even though they were exact same level of proximity from the shooter, they were in equal danger. So he was meeting with the kid who was resilient. He said, you know, you went through a pretty traumatic event. You seem to be doing okay. And the kid says, yeah, I'm totally fine. He said, well, what do you attribute you're being resilient to? So the little boy said, look, he said, 2 weeks before the shooting, I went to an earthquake preparation course here in Los Angeles. And when the shooting started, I said to myself, well, this is a little bit like an earthquake, and I went for cover. Now, he in fact was no safer than the kid next to him, but he believed he was safer because his community and his family prepared him. And again, that's part of the power and importance of the conversations that we were talking about. And here too, conversations about if you're under tremendous financial pressure, just to reassure your kids and to help them understand, you know, we're all in this together. And you know, and even if we lose things, as long as we have each other, we're going to come out at the end of this in a way that'll be fine. And again, it turned out the loss of their toys, the loss of their house, I'm not saying it wasn't stressful, but it predicted nothing long-term when they were adults, okay? And then coping is what we've talked about in the past. Everybody has different stuff. Like when I say in the past, I'm talking about, I forget last time I was there. I doubt that. Rabbi Krebs, do I have time to tell the coping story about the 5 coping rooms in Israel? It's a very powerful story, or not?
Doctor, if people want to leave, they can leave, and it would not be offensive. So I think you can keep going. You and me left.
Could you just get me the names of anybody who leaves?
Sure.
I'm going to put them on. I'm going to put them on the list.
We'll
Okay.
try and feather them after the program.
Okay. Okay, great. No, seriously, if anybody has to leave, leave. But I'm going to share with you. I know I'm going over, but this story is the best story I have today, and it's one that changed my understanding of coping. Okay, and I apologize if it might be somewhat upsetting, but it's all for a good cause. But it goes like this. At the height of the Second Intifada in Israel, there was a team of therapists, about 40 therapists, who were had probably the worst job I could imagine anybody could have. Anytime there was a pigua in Israel, anytime there was a terror bombing, and that happened multiple times a day during that horrible period, they would go, their job was to go to the family's home and let them know that they just lost a mother, a father, a daughter, a brother, a son, and just stay with them at their side to give them solace. So you can imagine how they were totally burning out. They knew much more about trauma in their little finger than I'll know in my entire life, but they needed an outsider. It says in the Talmud, Ein chavish mater asmo mi beis ha'asurim. You can't free yourself from your own prison. So they went to, they invited me to go to spend a couple of weeks in Israel and to work with them. And one day, towards the end of my being there, I was giving a talk in the Jerusalem Trauma Center. Some of you may know Dr. Danny Brown, who I'm sure has visited, Sydney at some point, the world's leading expert on times like this. And I'm giving my PowerPoint to them on whatever aspect of trauma we were talking about. And we hear a bombing in the distance. We were right nearby. We smell that unmistakable smell of smoke. It was just horrible. It was literally very short distance from where we were. It was the Frank Sinatra cafeteria, which was a cafeteria on the Hebrew University campus on Har Hatzofim. If you ever go to visit there again, when we're allowed to go back to Israel, God willing, you'll see there. You'll see a plaque in memory. 9 people were killed. 7 of them happened to be Americans. And it was horrific. And of course, the phone starts ringing in the Jerusalem Trauma Center for these 40 therapists. And they were dispatched all over Israel to go and tell the terrible news to the direct family members of people who died. Then, after every therapist had cleared out, the phone rings again in Dr. Brown's office with the horrific news that there was a woman who worked in one of the summer camps in the middle of Israel, and they just found out that she also had perished in the bombing. And they were out of therapists. So Dr. Brown turns to me and he says, can you go and spend the day there and tell the kids what happened and just be there to help them with the coping? It's something that I've unfortunately had to do many times in the US, but he saw the look of horror on my face because my Hebrew, even though I understand Hebrew fine, my spoken Hebrew is a source of endless amusement and entertainment for every Israeli who ever hears me speak. So kindly, he sent his deputy director, who has since become one of the world's leading experts on trauma, Dr. Ruth Paparensic. So we both go there. We go to the summer camp. I walk in, we both walk in, and immediately the director of the camp is waiting for us, and he wasn't going to let any American tell him what to do, wisely. He put me and Dr. Paparensic in the corner of the room, and he gets up, as it should have been. Okay, it should always be somebody from inside. And he tells the kids the horrific news that this beloved woman had been killed in this pigua. And he tells them I set up 5 coping rooms. 5 coping rooms. One room, would be a writing room. You could write letters to the parents of this beloved woman about what a wonderful woman she was. And you could express your feelings through writing. The next room was an art room. It was filled with art supplies. Express yourselves artistically. The next room was a music room. They had Sony Walkman. This was before the age of iPods or iPads. Okay, you could listen to music or play musical instruments. The next room was the talking room, and then the 5th room was the tefillah room for prayer. And the kids were told you could go from room to room throughout the day. And an amazing thing happened that I learned so much from. The kids sort of naturally divided themselves into 4 equal groups, okay? One room was not picked at all. Anybody want to guess what room wasn't picked?
Well, I'm the only one who can unmute himself, so so I'll leave it there.
Okay, I'll save for you. The one room that wasn't picked was tefillah. It was too soon for prayer. There are times that we're too raw to necessarily be able to connect through prayer. Not everybody, but at least these kids couldn't connect through prayer. But exactly a quarter of the kids wrote and spent the whole day writing. And a quarter of the kids spent the whole day talking to me and Dr. Patarenzik with incredibly powerful sharing with us their feelings about the losses they had been through, family members, friends, and how this was just one more loss. And we had an incredibly powerful day where they shared. A quarter of the kids chose music, and a quarter of the kids also chose. So it was art. So it was art, music, talking, and what's the last one? Art, music, talking, and not prayer, art, music, talking, and whatever the 4th one was. But let me finish the story. Here's where the story becomes incredibly powerful for me. The next week was the first anniversary of 9/11. And I spoke at one of the commemorations in New York. And I was very impacted by what I learned from the story of the 5 coping rooms. And a woman came over to me afterwards, and she told me the following story, and with this, I'll end this section. She said that her father was in the concentration camp, was Elie Wiesel's bunkmate in the concentration camp. She says her father is a Vishnitz chassid, okay, very into music, very into connecting through music. And he and Elie Wiesel were bunkmates there. And the week before, Professor Wiesel was giving a talk in Manhattan. And as she was leaving to go hear Professor Wiesel's talk, her father stopped her and said he lives with her. And he said, please tell Elie that we're all so proud of him. He says, he probably won't even remember me. It was so many years ago. He said, but all the guys who were in the camps together, because they were together in the camps, they were together on the death march. He says, please tell him we're incredibly proud of his Nobel Prize. We're incredibly proud of how he didn't let the world forget what we went through. And please go and tell him. Thank him. So she waits till after Professor Wiesel's lecture. She waits online and she says, I'm so-and-so's daughter. He doesn't think you even remember him. And Professor Wiesel says, are you kidding? Remember him? Don't you know that that anything I've accomplished in the world, including my Nobel Prize, is as much his as it is mine? He says, I can't believe he never told you this story, but let me tell you why I'm here today. He said there was a day that was horrible, even by concentration camp standards. And we were all past the point of endurance. And we couldn't go on. And a group of Russian prisoners of war in the camp with us got a hold of some rat poison. And they all went online, took it. They all said, look, they're torturing us anyway. Let's take our lives into our own hands. And they took the poison and laid down to end their lives. Adolescence is a time that suicide is quite contagious. And every adolescent in that part of the camp went online. All of us, fully intending to make that the last minutes on this earth. Everybody but your father, the chassid, were ready to take the poison. And your father goes to the side of the line and he breaks into the ancient Vishnitsa Niggun, the ancient Hasidic tune, for Ani Mamin B'Emunah Shlema B'Vias HaMashiach. I believe in ultimate redemption. And your father's song, he says, broke our suicidal spell. One by one, every one of us left the line. We formed a circle around your father and sang the Ani Mamin. He says, the only reason I'm here is because of that tune, because of that song. Coping comes in many different flavors. Sometimes it's writing, sometimes it's music, sometimes it's art, sometimes it's prayer, and sometimes it's song. The important thing to keep in mind is everybody's going to have a somewhat different toolbox of coping mechanisms. When we would do therapy with kids who've gone through some terrible trauma and abuse, we would literally show them somewhat upsetting movie clips, have them rated on a scale of 1 to 10 about how upsetting it was. Then we'd have a table in the middle of the room in these groups that we did that would have on it 13 different coping mechanisms. It might be hand lotions to rub on themselves. It might be like some aromatherapy, perfumes to smell. It might be the distraction of sports magazines, or it might be art materials, or it might be music. And we can never predict which coping mechanisms kids would take. They take it, they pick 4 or 5 coping mechanisms that made them feel best, and we've had them tell us, where are you on a scale of 1 to 10 now? And they got better and better with time. But the bottom line is we have to remember that as the Talmud tells us on the passage in Proverbs, the Mishlei Dagab Lavish Yashchena. So there's a disagreement between Rabbi Yami and Ravasi on how to handle worry. One way of thinking about it, they say worry is distract yourself. Distract, distract, distract. The other Talmudic scholar says, light up Broca's area, talk about it. Interestingly, there isn't a single commentary anywhere in any Jewish source I've ever found that says that one is better than the other. It could be that talking is better, but over time that might be. But in the short term, support each other. Ask each of your family members, what helps you cope? Okay? And allow them to use that, because it's going to be very different. Spouses tend to have totally different coping mechanisms. And when you accept it and go with it, with time, you tend to meet each other halfway. But that's C in terms of that. Then connection, I think we already talked about it, and the incredible power of being at somebody's side, and not doing this alone. This talk is part of the partnership with schools, with synagogues, with family. And we already talked about how important it is about finances as well, to monitor your conversation. Remember, children don't have the same perspective that adults do, and they may have exaggerated fears because of what they overhear about finances. This child who his father was fired, that's my childhood memory. I remember as a little kid many, many years ago. Okay, I'm 68 now. When I was a young guy, I remember being maybe about 5, 6 years old. My father was a rabbi. I remember coming home from school one day and hearing about somebody in my father's shul in Far Rockaway, the white shul, somebody who was fired. And I remember being horrified because I pictured this guy who I really liked being tied up and burned at the stake. To me, that's what fired meant. And I don't know how long it took before I figured out that fired was a term for somebody losing their job. Very easy for kids to misunderstand it, okay? So, and then pay attention to temperament, okay, in terms of finances. It's the anxious children who are wired in a way that they get discouraged, children who have gone through and families who have gone through with all kinds of prior loss. They're going to have the hardest time at times of financial risk, and we have to pay more attention to them. And we already did the other points here, okay? Again, correlates of resilience in the Iowa studies, putting family first is protective. It's a very important point. When parents are overwhelmed and become angry, irritable, or withdrawn, consequently offer children low levels of support, okay? You have to stay strong for your kids. I know that's not a very comforting thing to hear. You have every right to be upset, but you also, your kids need you. And they need to know that you're surrounding them with your protective shield. And connection to the community is all important in the Iowa studies and Dr. Connor's studies. And the most corrosive is if there's a lot of irritability, yelling and screaming. That's not great. Now, it's very hard not to do it. Don't beat yourself up if you're doing it. But try your hardest to take a pullback. In the Middle Ages, there was a classic book called Sefer HaChasidim. And that classic book had 3 words that says it all. Achris kitata charata. After argument, there's regret. And isn't that true? When we lose our cool, we almost feel really badly afterwards. So do your best to just walk away, take a couple of breaths, and try to do it that way. Okay, and we already did these other issues. Okay, I think you'll see when you get this that there's some more things. And I'm going to end with the story and first the Jewish thought. The Jewish thought goes like this. It's from the Maharal, again, going back to the Middle Ages. And this is a thought for Pesach, for Passover. And he says, why is it there's this weird kind of contradiction in that there are 2 words for matzah, right? There's the word for egg matzah, which isn't necessarily the preferred kind of matzah, although this year, from what I understand, almost anything goes. But there's egg matzah. Egg matzah in the Hebrew is called lechem ashira, okay? Which means a rich man's matzah. And then there's the hand matzah, which is just flour and water. And that's called lechem oni, okay? So the obvious question that the Maharal asks is, what is lechem oni? What is this simple matzah, just flour and water, have to do with freedom, which is the main theme of what Passover, what the Seder is all about? Okay, so here's what he says. Matzah is called the bread of affliction, the bread of poverty. The opposite of matzah is shira, okay? So he says, because when we have a matzah, like egg matzah, mixed with oil and honey, that's called ashira, wealthy, okay? Because it enhances the bread, okay? But he says, but what's the symbolism of shmura matzah, of the matzah, the preferred kind of matzah? It's ani ein lo ela atzma. It's the brilliant lesson that a poor person only has himself or herself. He doesn't have money. He just has himself. And when we recognize that we have ourselves, when we recognize that we always have control over our reaction, he says there's nothing as powerful as that knowledge. There's nothing as powerful as that knowledge, okay? Is that you know, we always have control over our perspective, as I said. Okay? Okay? He says, that's the key of the lesson of Pesach. Okay? The poor man only has himself, unlike a slave who doesn't have the freedom. She'enu omei ba'atzmo. Okay? But here we have to remember that that's the key. As Cook said, okay? Mi shekol chayav rak b'mashetov v'yafeh b'einei acherim hu'evet. A person who might be very, very wealthy, okay, but only worries about what others think of him or her, is always going to be a slave. What we have to aim for is our inner voice and our inner understanding of what matters in life. And that's what this time is all about. And let me end with the story, okay? The story goes like this. A number of years ago, I was invited to a homeless conference. I was very excited because I thought it'd be really interesting to hang out with a bunch of homeless people. Conference was in Midtown Manhattan. And I get there, I was sort of surprised because I wasn't being asked to hang out with homeless people. It was the Waldorf Astoria Ballroom in the center of Manhattan. 400 very well-dressed professionals from around the United States and Canada who specialize in meeting the needs of the homeless. There were two speakers on this big dais. There was me, okay, and then there was the main speaker, the true keynote speaker. And he spoke before me, and when I read his bio, I was blown away by this guy. He was a very good-looking guy, incredibly well-dressed. I'm not tuned into clothing at all, but even I could tell that he was wearing, you know, like a $10,000 suit. And then you read his bio. His bio was unbelievable. It says, the Dr. So-and-so is in charge of homeless policy for the United States. He has his bachelor's from Harvard, his master's from Harvard, his PhD from Harvard. Last year, he won an Oscar for a documentary he did on homelessness. And then it just goes on and on and on. And he gets up to give the first speech. And the first sentence out of his mouth was so shocking, in contrast to that bio, you almost saw 400 people collectively fall off their seats. Here's his opening line. He said, when I was 9 years old, in front of me, my father, in a rage fueled by abusing crack and cocaine, right in front of me, took my mother's life and then took his life. He said, I was 9 years old. I was an only child. But I was a smart kid. I realized that I was about to fall in the hands of the foster care system, which in my neighborhood was a horrific place to be. So I run away. And I spent the next 2 years totally plagued by post-traumatic stress symptoms, totally lonely, totally beside myself with grief and sadness and isolation. And I go from shelter to shelter. When I thought that they were on to me in one shelter and realized that I was too young to be in a shelter, I would run away to the next shelter. And it was 2 horrific years till I get into a shelter in the middle of Manhattan and I hear 4 words that explain how I accomplished what I accomplished and how I came to the point of accomplishing everything you read on my bio. 400 pens come out. You have 400 people who are ready to write. What's the answer? 4 words. You know, wouldn't it be nice if we had 4 words that could give the answer to really helping people going through very tough times? He says, put your pens away. It's not the words, it's how they were spoken. He says, I come into a shelter in Manhattan, and the director of the shelter looked me in the eyes. And I saw he really was looking at me. And he puts his arm around me. And he says, how are you doing? And it's not the 4 words. He says, I just saw he really wanted to hear. He really wanted to hear. The Hebrew word ozen, the Hebrew word for ear, is etymologically tied to the Hebrew word maznayim, a scale. There's something very balancing about hearing somebody, okay? And I started telling him. And every night after he finished his work at the shelter, we'd sit together for the next couple of months, and I poured my heart out to him. And after about, certain number of months of opening myself up to this guy, he realized that I was a pretty smart guy. And he gets me a full scholarship to the Dalton School, which is the leading private school of the United States. Full scholarship. That's where he lived, and that's where he was educated. From there, he earned a full scholarship to Harvard undergraduate and graduate. And he says it all came from those 4 words. And I'm leaving you with that message, okay? The message is the message of that's what's really in our control. What's really in our control is, as our rabbis say, "Kamayim hapanim opanim kein leifa adam." Just like our reflection comes back to us when we look down in a body of water, so too our hearts bounce off each other. And that's where real resilience lies. Real resilience lies in our ability to turn to every member of our family, every member of our community, every member of our country going through unparalleled, frightening times, and to ask, how are you doing? Thank you.
Doctor, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to connect, and the fact that we have had close to 200 people plus people coming and going at late at night and very early in the morning your time is just a tribute to the enormous content and delivery that you have given us. So just thank you so much. If anyone has questions, I think it might be a bit late to go for questions, but I'm happy to, if they want to forward them on to me, I can forward them on to you. And just really you should stay safe, and please God, Pesach Chag Kasher v'Sameach, and please God, we should all get through this, and we should meet again in Yerushalayim.
Amen. Refuas nefesh and refuas good for everybody. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. The recording will be available. I'll post it shortly. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and if you could share the recording with me,
Absolutely.
I wasn't listening to a word I said, so thank you. Okay.
I'll share the recording if you could please email me the slides, and I'll be able to post them along with the recording.
Oh yeah, I'll do that right now. Thank you.
Doctor, are you happy with me to post this on YouTube, this video?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening and stay safe.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm just going to end it for everybody.